The execution was scheduled for sunrise. Captain Elias Carter knelt in the center of the platform, wrists bound in steel restraints, his face battered but his spirit unbroken. The air was sharp with the scent of scorched metal and ozone, the remains of past executions still lingering in the wind. Towering pylons crackled with raw energy behind him, and in the sky above, the Imperial warships loomed like silent sentinels, watching. The crowd had gathered in the thousands, a sea of Imperial citizens, soldiers, and officials, some here for duty, others for the spectacle. At the platform's edge, a squad of enforcers stood rigid, their black armor gleaming under the harsh floodlights. Overhead, floating drones hovered, broadcasting the event across the entire empire. A voice cut through the static-charged air, amplified by the warden's mechanized throat implant. Elias Carter, captain of the human insurgency, enemy of the throne. You are sentenced to death for crimes against the empire. Your rebellion ends here. Elias slowly lifted his head. A fresh gash across his temple dripped blood onto the cold steel beneath him, but he paid it no mind. His gaze swept the crowd, settling finally on the warden, a gaunt, reptilian creature with dark, polished skin and sunken eyes. A smirk ghosted Elias's lips. You should have killed me in the dark. Quietly, without a show. The warden clicked his tongue, a sound of amusement or irritation. You don't deserve such mercy. Elias inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He thought of her. He thought of the promise he had made all those years ago, before war and fate had torn them apart. His hands curled into fists against the restraints. You have no idea what you've just done. The warden tilted his head, but there was no time to question. With a single motion, he signaled to the executioners. The plasma cannon roared. A column of searing blue light consumed Elias Carter, his body dissolving into nothingness in an instant. A hush fell over the gathered crowd, and then cheers. Celebration. The broadcast cut, and the Empire moved on. But far across the stars, aboard the warship Revenant, someone was watching. The command deck was silent, save for the soft hum of machinery and the distant murmurs of crew members who didn't yet dare to speak. The holoscreen flickered once before the broadcast ended, the execution's final image burning into the minds of those present. General Serafina Carter did not move. She stood at the helm of the ship, hands resting on the edges of the command table, shoulders rigid. The light from the holo display cast sharp shadows across her face, accentuating the deadly stillness of her expression. The officers stationed around her, hardened warriors who had followed her through countless battles, watched with wary silence. They had seen her in war, seen her carve through enemy lines like a force of nature. But now she did nothing. Then softly, too softly, her voice cut through the stillness. They took him from me. No one spoke. Serafina closed her eyes for a single breath. The silence pressed in. The weight of grief sat heavy in her chest, but beneath it, something deeper, something colder began to rise. When she opened her eyes, the storm had settled. What remained was something far more dangerous. Her fingers tightened against the war table, and with a sharp crack, the reinforced metal beneath her hand fractured. A sharp inhale, a slow exhale. Bring me the battle map. One of the officers hesitated before hastily pressing a command into the console. A new image flared to life above the table. The Imperial prison world where Elias had been held, where he had died. The fortress city, the planetary defenses, the station fleet. Serafina studied it, her mind already dissecting its weaknesses. They thought this would break me, she said, voice steady. They thought I would grieve, surrender, disappear. Her head lifted, and when she looked at her officers, there was no sadness in her eyes. Only purpose, only fire. They've made the greatest mistake in the history of their empire. Colonel Damaris, her second-in-command, stepped forward cautiously. General, if we attack outright, though. Burn. The word was quiet, but hit the room like a gunshot. Damaris straightened. Understood. Serafina turned back to the battle map, expression unreadable. Prepare the fleet. We move at once. The orders were given, and the Revenant roared to life. Within the hour, the warship emerged from hyperspace, its cannons already locking onto targets. The Imperial fleet stationed above the prison world barely had time to react before the first wave of bombardments tore through them. Explosions blossomed against the darkness, metal rupturing in bursts of flame and debris. Serafina stood on the bridge, watching the destruction unfold, her expression impassive. "Status?" she asked. "Enemy fleet is crippled," came the response. "Ground forces mobilizing to defend." Serafina exhaled. "Deploy our own. I want every Imperial officer in that city executed." She turned to the weapons officer. "Target their command center. Ensure they see it coming." A beat of hesitation. Then, "Yes, General." Another blast erupted from the Revenant, a spear of light piercing the Imperial headquarters below. The structure crumbled in an instant, a firestorm swallowing it whole. Serafina watched, but it wasn't enough. "Not yet. Prepare my dropship," she ordered. Damaris stepped forward again. "You're leading the ground assault yourself?" She met his gaze. Elias died down there. No further argument. Within minutes, the dropship cut through the smoke-choked sky, flanked by squadrons of human warriors, soldiers who had followed Serafina through the worst of wars, who had seen the depths of her ruthlessness and still stood beside her. The landing was swift, brutal. Fire raged across the streets, the scent of burning metal thick in the air. Imperial soldiers scrambled, but they were already lost. Serafina moved like a phantom through the battlefield, her plasma blade igniting in her grasp. The first wave of enemies barely had time to react before she cut them down, each strike methodical, precise. Her focus shifted as she spotted movement ahead. The Imperial governor, the one who had overseen Elias's execution, was fleeing toward an evac transport. Not today. Serafina intercepted him with ease, stepping into his path. The governor, a trembling, thin-boned alien, froze in place, hands lifted. "General Carter," he stammered. "Please, I had no choice." She didn't let him finish. The plasma blade burned through him in a single, swift motion. He collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. Serafina exhaled, watching the light fade from his eyes. The Empire had stolen her heart, her home, her love. And now, she would take everything from them in return. She turned to her soldiers. Their banners waved high, their weapons glowed in the night, and the city around them burned. "This is only the beginning," she said, and above them, the Imperial flags were reduced to ash. The screams had long since faded, drowned beneath the roaring inferno that swallowed the Imperial stronghold whole. General Serafina Carter stepped over the remains of the fallen, her boots pressing deep into scorched metal and ash. The city was dying around her. Flames licked hungrily at the skyline. Sirens howled in panic, and in the distance, the last remnants of the Imperial resistance were being torn apart. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a purge. The Revenant's orbital cannons had done their work. The Imperial fleet was decimated, the planetary defenses shattered. Serafina's forces had swept through the streets like a storm, crushing anything that stood between them and vengeance. Still, her hands did not stop moving. Her blade flickered, a ghostly blue in the smog-choked air, cutting down the last of the high-ranking officers who had dared to stay behind. A ragged gasp, a final gurgle, then silence. She exhaled slowly. This was only the first step. Behind her, Colonel Damaris approached, helmet tucked under his arm. His armor was splattered with soot and streaked with dark, drying blood. "The city is ours," he reported. "Their leaders are dead or captured. No organized resistance remains." Serafina gave a slow nod, gaze sweeping across the ruins. "And the civilian sectors?" Damaris hesitated. Most of them fled once the first bombardment hit. Some surrendered, others didn't. A scream echoed from the streets below. A brutal sound, one that spoke of Imperial officers being repaid in full for years of subjugation. Serafina did not flinch. The people of this world had cheered when the Empire took her husband's life. Now, they would learn the cost of their allegiance. "Let them run," she said at last. "They'll carry the message." Damaris nodded, but something about his stance was rigid. The other warlords will take notice. They'll know this wasn't just another skirmish. Good, she said. Let them fear what's coming. A sudden crackle of static came through her comlink. General, a voice buzzed. We've secured the main prison complex. No high-value prisoners remain, but you need to see this. Serafina's jaw tightened. Elias had been executed in the city's heart, far from the cells he had been kept in. She had stormed the Imperial headquarters, slaughtered every officer within it, and still, the ache in her chest had not dulled. If there was anything left to find, she had to see it. Send me the coordinates, she said. Minutes later, she was striding through the crumbling remains of the Imperial prison, the scent of rust and old death thick in the air. The holding cells were still operational, the energy fields casting eerie blue light against the steel corridors. The few prisoners who remained huddled in the corners of their cells, staring at her with wide, desperate eyes. But Serafina barely looked at them. Instead, she followed the officer who had called her, his expression grim. He led her past the standard cells, through a corridor lined with reinforced walls, and into a chamber sealed behind thick blast doors. Her gut twisted the moment she stepped inside. The room was small, sterile, and filled with the acrid scent of burnt flesh. On the far wall, a single hollow screen was active, lines of data scrolling endlessly across its surface. A surgical table sat in the center of the room, restraints still locked into place. A handful of Imperial data chips were scattered across a side console, their contents decrypted and displayed on the hollow screen. Serafina stepped closer. Her eyes scanned the lines of text. Her pulse went still. Subject, Carter Elias. Experiment Phase 3, Psychogenic Reprogramming. Status, terminated. Genetic sequencing results. The words blurred. Her mind struggled to process them. Experiment. Reprogramming. Terminated. She had been prepared for many things. She had braced herself for the horrors of an Imperial prison. But this was something else entirely. A chill spread through her limbs. What is this? The officer shifted uneasily. We're still decrypting, but it looks like he's swallowed. They weren't just holding him, General. They were testing something on him. Try to rewrite his neural pathways. There's heavy mention of an experimental procedure, something about genetic modification and forced loyalty conditioning. Serafina stared at the hollow screen, her fingers curling into fists. They had tried to break him, not just physically but mentally. They had tried to rewire his mind, to turn him into something else. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with something raw and deadly. Damaris spoke carefully. If this is true, General, then Elias, he might not have died as himself. The words sent a blade of ice through her ribs. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. He had endured so much. They had tortured him, twisted his mind, and when they couldn't control him, they had erased him. The last thing he had said before they executed him echoed in her memory. Asterisk. You have no idea what you've just done. Asterisk. She exhaled, slow and steady. This changes nothing, she said. Damaris studied her. Doesn't it? She turned to face him. We were always going to burn the Empire to the ground. Her voice was iron, unwavering. Now we do it faster. Damaris hesitated, but then he nodded. A new order came through the comms. General, we've located the last remnants of the Imperial resistance. Awaiting your command. Serafina stepped away from the hollow screen. Leave no survivors, she ordered. As she walked away, the hollow screen flickered, the final data entries scrolling into oblivion. The last records of what had been done to Elias Carter. The last evidence of what the Empire had stolen from her. But Serafina didn't look back. She had an empire to destroy. The Empire's capital burned, and the skies wept fire. Serafina stood at the command deck of the Revenant, watching the devastation unfold through the reinforced viewport. Below, the Imperial stronghold, the very heart of the regime, was engulfed in chaos. Explosions blossomed across the cityscape, battles raged in the streets, and the air was thick with the screams of the dying. Victory was inevitable. The Empire, once unshakable, was now crumbling beneath the weight of her wrath. Yet there was no satisfaction. Her hands curled in a fist behind her back as reports flooded in. The Imperial fleet had been reduced to debris, its warships reduced to broken husks drifting in orbit. The High Chancellor was dead. The ruling council had fled like rats. The Empire's forces were scattered, leaderless, grasping for control they would never regain. And still, it wasn't enough. Damaris approached her cautiously. "General, the palace is breached. The last of their command staff is barricaded inside the throne room. They won't last much longer." Serafina didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the burning world below. Elias should have been here. He should have been standing beside her, watching the Empire pay for its sins. He should have seen their oppressors fall, their chains shattered, their tormentors kneeling in the ashes of their own making. But the Empire had taken him. And no matter how many cities burned, no matter how many bodies fell, she could never take him back. Damaris shifted. "General." She inhaled slowly, the fire in her chest burning colder. "Deploy the execution squads. No prisoners." He hesitated. "None." Serafina turned to face him. Her expression was carved from stone, her eyes dark with something unreadable. "The Empire showed my husband no mercy," she said. "They deserve none in return." Damaris held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Understood." The order was relayed. The final slaughter began. Serafina turned back to the viewport, watching as the last vestiges of Imperial rule were snuffed out like dying embers. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt nothing. A sharp chime interrupted her thoughts. "General," a voice crackled through the comms. "You want to see this?" Serafina's pulse slowed. "Report." "We found something in the Imperial archives," the officer said. "Something about Captain Elias Carter." Silence. Serafina's heart pounded once, twice. Then, with controlled precision, she turned and strode toward the warship's intelligence sector. She arrived at the archive room within minutes, where a cluster of officers stood before a massive holographic display. Lines of decrypted data scrolled across the screen, Imperial records, classified transmissions, medical logs. And then she saw it. Subject: Carter Elias. Status: transferred. New designation: Asset 004. Location: the world lurched. Her breath turned to ice in her lungs. She stared at the words, unable to comprehend them. Transferred, not terminated. He was alive. Or worse, he had been turned into something else. The officers remained silent, waiting. Damaris was the first to speak. "General, if this is accurate." She was already moving. Her fingers flew over the command panel, pulling up more records, searching, hunting for the truth. The files were fragmented, half deleted, but they told enough. The Empire had taken him. They had done something to him. And then, before his execution, they had moved him. She had thought her revenge was complete. She had been wrong. "Where?" she demanded. The officer swallowed. "The files reference a deep space research facility." He hesitated. "One of the Empire's black sites. Off the books. High security. If he's there, General." Serafina turned sharply. "Prepare the fleet. Set coordinates immediately." Damaris hesitated. "We just won the war," he said carefully. "If we leave now, the remnants of the Empire could regroup. We need to solidify our control, establish a new order." Serafina's gaze burned into him. "I did not fight this war to sit on a throne," she said. "I fought it for him, and I'm not done." The room was silent. Then, "Yes, General." Within the hour, the fleet was on the move, cutting through the void like a blade. Serafina stood at the bridge, her hands resting against the control panel, her body vibrating with a cold, violent purpose. The war for the Empire was over. But the war for Elias Carter had just begun. The moment the doors burst open, Serafina saw him. Elias Carter stood in the center of the sterile, dimly lit chamber, shackled to the floor by thick restraints. Electrodes clung to his temples, wires running from his arms into an array of flickering machines. His head was bowed, his breathing slow and measured, like a predator waiting for the moment to strike. But the moment she stepped forward, his head snapped up. Her heart stopped. His eyes, once warm, once filled with fire, were empty. Cold. Programmed. For the first time in years, Serafina Carter felt fear. The black site facility had fallen like every other Imperial stronghold before it. Her forces had swept through the station, annihilating resistance, leaving nothing but bodies in their wake. She had stormed through the corridors with one singular goal: to find Elias, to bring him back. And now he was here, alive. But he was not himself. Elias, she breathed, stepping closer. His muscles tensed. A flicker of recognition passed through his features, but it was drowned by something deeper, something darker. He did not move, did not speak. Then a voice crackled through the speakers overhead. "You shouldn't have come, General Carter." Serafina spun, eyes narrowing at the observation deck above. Behind reinforced glass stood the last of the facility's command staff, scientists, overseers, the ones who had turned her husband into this. A woman in a pristine white coat stepped forward, lips curling into a smug smile. "I must commend your persistence," the scientist mused. "Few would wage a war against an empire for love. Fewer still would follow that war into the abyss." She tilted her head. "But you should have let him die." Serafina's pulse hammered in her skull. "What did you do to him?" The scientist's smile widened. "The same thing we've done to countless others. We refined him, improved him." A slow pause. "We made him better." A sharp hiss cut through the air. The machines linked to Elias pulsed with light, and suddenly he moved. The chains groaned as he pulled against them. His fingers twitched. His breathing changed, controlled, precise, unnatural. "Elias," Serafina said again, softer this time. "It's me." He lifted his gaze to her, but there was no flicker of recognition, no relief, no love. Then the chains snapped. In a blur of motion, Elias surged forward. Serafina barely had time to react. She dodged just as his fist slammed into the metal wall where she had stood a heartbeat earlier, leaving a dent in solid steel. He was fast, too fast. Her stomach clenched. "Stand down," she ordered, raising her hands. But he was already moving again. Another strike, another near miss. He was relentless, every movement honed for a single purpose: destruction. The scientist's voice rang through the chamber, filled with twisted satisfaction. "He's magnificent, isn't he? You should be honored, General. He's our finest creation." Serafina barely heard her. She ducked under another strike, rolling to the side. She had fought countless battles, faced monsters in the Empire's ranks, but this was something else. This was Elias, the man she had fought for, had bled for, and he was trying to kill her. Her throat tightened. "Elias," she said, voice sharp, commanding. "Remember who you are." He hesitated. It was barely a flicker, half a second, no more, but she saw it. The briefest hesitation, a crack in the armor of whatever they had done to him. But then the machines pulsed again, and he lunged. She had no choice. She moved faster than thought, twisting to avoid the strike, drawing the combat knife from her belt in one smooth motion. The blade was at his throat in an instant. For a single, agonizing moment, they stood locked together, his body pressed against hers, her knife poised at his jugular. Serafina's breathing was ragged. "I did not come here to kill you," she whispered, "but I will not let them keep you like this." His jaw clenched. The muscles in his arms tensed. And then, the voice from the observation deck turned sharp. "Override command. Terminate hostile." Elias's body jerked. His breath hitched, his fingers spasming as something forced him to move. Serafina's eyes widened. "No, no." She acted without thinking. With a furious snarl, she wrenched the knife away and drove it straight into the base of the control unit embedded in his spine. A burst of electricity crackled through the air. Elias shouted, a raw, agonized sound that tore through the chamber as the machine inside him short-circuited. Then, silence. He collapsed against her. Serafina barely caught him before he hit the ground. She pressed her forehead to his, her breath shaking. Elias. He was still. His body trembled violently, muscles twitching as the override system failed. His hands clenched around her arms, as if grounding himself. Then, so faint she almost missed it. His fingers curled into the fabric of her uniform. Sarah. The word was hoarse, weak, but it was him. A broken sob escaped her lips. I'm here, she whispered. I've got you. The scientist's shriek of rage shattered the moment. Asterisk no. Asterisk. Serafina's head snapped up just as alarms blared through the facility. Emergency lockdown protocols activated, turrets deploying from the walls, countdown warnings flashing red across every screen. The scientist's voice was venomous. If we can't have him, neither can you. Serafina's gut twisted. She had minutes, maybe less, but she had Elias. She tore the electrodes from his skin, threw his arm over her shoulders, and lifted him to his feet. He was weak, barely able to stand, but his grip on her was steady. And for the first time in years, he was looking at her, truly looking at her. Hold on, she murmured, tightening her grip. We're getting out of here. The doors burst open behind them, Damaris and her soldiers storming in, weapons raised. She didn't even need to give the order. The Revenant's cannons opened fire, tearing through the Black Site station with unrelenting fury. Her forces covered their escape, cutting down anything that moved. And together, after all the war, after all the blood, after all the loss, Serafina Carter led her husband back into the stars. The Empire was dead, and Elias Carter was free,